Suddenly, you find yourself face to face with spoilers and degeneracy.
Oh, this is a crime! Oh no! Oh my god!
Alan Wake, a shining example of games in the early 2010s. It has it all. Clunky driving, liberal use of slow motion, turret sections, unsettling facial animations, and excellent camera work. 2010 video game booty. I'm down, Cataclysmic, please send help. While it may be derivative in these ways, Alan Wake is so much more than just some game made over a decade ago. Sometimes for the better, and sometimes for the worse. But before we can really get into it, you need a quick rundown of what the game is about. Warning, narrative discussion incoming. Skip to here if you don't give a shit about that and just want to hear about the game stuff. Famous author Alan Wake and his wife Alice visit the small rural town of Bright Falls, Oregon to take a vacation and relieve some of the pressure bearing down on Alan to break through his writer's block. However, soon after arriving at the cabin they'll be staying in, Alice reveals that she had an ulterior motive behind coming to Bright Falls, to see if a change of scenery and the aid of a local psychiatrist specializing in treating artists would help Alan's writing get back on track. Frustrated, Alan storms off to get some fresh air, knowing Alice won't follow him into the night because she's afraid of the dark. As he's fuming, he hears Alice scream for help from the cabin and he rushes back. He finds the back porch's railing broken and Alice sinking into the lake below. After diving in after her, he is immediately plunged into the supernatural darkness lurking in the lake and loses consciousness, awakening to find himself in a crashed car 7 days later. The rest of the base game is spent searching for Alice. During the day, this involves various interactions with side characters, of which there is, but not limited to, Barry, Alan's friend and literary agent, a pair of senile Viking rock stars, Dr. Hartman, the previously mentioned psychiatrist, and Sheriff Baker, one of the only sensible law enforcement characters in a supernatural setting ever. But when night falls, Alan's search becomes more perilous as he is pursued by hordes of townsfolk possessed by a mysterious entity from an alternate dimension called the Dark Presence. Luckily though, Thomas Zane, a dude floating around in a glowing diver's suit, is willing to help him out with clues and direction. Finally, in the DLC taking place after the conclusion of the search for Alice, Alan finds himself trapped in a bizarre alternate dimension known as the Dark Place. In this place, thoughts and imagination shape reality, and without meaning to, Alan manifests his inner demons in the form of an insane version of himself. This darker part of his psyche is intent on killing Alan, and takes advantage of their imagination to conjure enemies and dangerous traps to do so. So, are we confused yet? Do we have questions? Good, because there is a lot going on in this game with the main plot, subplots, and symbolism that I barely even scratched the surface of due to not wanting this video to be over an hour long and believing that an in-depth summary would just fall flat anyways. That being said, this multitude of stuff going on and the difficulty explaining everything attached to it is only an issue to people trying to fully explain it secondhand. This is because all that said stuff going on is woven together in such a way that it can only fully be appreciated and understood through experiencing it yourself. It's almost like one of Stephen King's longer books, who in case you couldn't tell was a major source of inspiration for this game, among other things. To illustrate what I mean, let's take a peek into one of his nearly universally well-received novels, It. Kids are disappearing in the town of Derry, Maine, and an evil clown with supernatural powers known as Pennywise is responsible. It begins tormenting Bill, Beverly, Ben, Richie, Eddie, Mike, and Stan, a group of kids known as the Losers Club, and is intent on indulging in spooky shenanigans before making them disappear as well. But the Losers Club ain't gonna take that shit, so they band together to try and figure out a way to stop Pennywise. Eventually learning he lives in the sewers beneath Derry, they confront it in the sewers, and Bill discovers something called the Ritual of Chud, which prompts him to bite Pennywise's tongue so he can enter its mind and fight it there. During the Battle of Wills, he meets a cosmic gigaturtle named Maturin, who created the universe by throwing it up after having a bad stomachache. Then, as celestial turtles obviously do, it proceeds to help Bill defeat Pennywise. After this, the kids get lost on their way out of the sewers, and all the boys run a train on Beverly to, solidify the unity of their group via sewer orgy? I believe it's supposed to be a metaphor for leaving childhood behind and entering adulthood, or something. I don't know. Coke King was fucking wild. Anyways, they eventually find their way out of the sewer and swear a blood oath that should Pennywise ever come back, they'd all return to Derry to beat his fucking ass. But as the years go by, they drift apart, forgetting about Pennywise and everything that happened as they grew up, until it inevitably comes back. So, as you can see, my explanation of this portion of the book is kinda shit. Not because it isn't accurate, but because it's damn near impossible to satisfactorily convey the entirety of something like this through secondhand explanation. It's like trying to explain Metamorphosis. Hearing about it and experiencing it are two very different things, and I feel that Alan Wake is similar in that way. Another way Alan Wake and It are similar is how they go about explanations for what the fuck's going on. In books like It, a lot of story stuff is explained in such a way that allows the reader to get a baseline understanding of everything and the ability to form their own interpretation of anything past that baseline. For instance, Pennywise's true form is described as essentially evil lights from beyond time and space. It's a good enough explanation to wrap your head around while also allowing one to extrapolate further if they wanted to. Alan Wake does this with some of its own story elements, such as the Dark Presence, which is basically described as an evil entity from a spooky dimension. The advantage of this type of storytelling is that it allows the plot to not focus too heavily on the how behind these things and can instead focus on the what and why. What I mean by this is that it can focus on things that are actually happening, such as what the characters do, what happens to them, and their backstories, all of which usually results in the how being a vehicle for developing the characters and exploring their drama, and I'm pretty happy the people behind Alan Wake, Remedy Games, took this approach and kept the story simple and clean, because I feel that in these psychologically driven projects, it's better to focus on the character and narrative instead of slowing everything down with explanations about how your alternate dimension would scientifically function if it were real. It's like a foot job in a long-form doujin you somehow gotten invested in. Some people like it, but when you're not into it, it drags on forever and fucks up the flow, and delays getting back to what you're really there for, and just like fucking smash that shit already, get back to the handholding, fuck! With all that said though, Alan Wake is a video game, and unlike something such as It, the player is not forced to experience the entirety of the narrative, which can be bad because the game puts a good chunk of its story and characterization in optional content. For instance, throughout the game you come across manuscript pages written by Alan during the 7 days he can't remember, but you are not forced to read them, and some are even hidden or only available in nightmare mode, the hardest difficulty. This can be an issue because they are very important to fully understanding the story, and are the difference between the characters potentially being endearing or coming off like cardboard. This means a lot of what makes Alan Wake special can be lost, or even cause the story to be pretty mediocre and nonsensical if someone ignores the pages. With all that said though, I imagine that the people who aren't interested in this optional content were probably already turned off by the game's premise, one of the losers who skipped the narrative section of this video and only care about visuals or gameplay or something. But don't tell him I said that, okay? Speaking of all that other stuff, the combat is so fucking good. Dodging potentially breaks the game when you get good at it though, but it kind of always does when implemented in these kinds of games. That doesn't make it not feel good though, especially on Nightmare mode where single hits can almost kill you, making the power of the jukes feel more or less balanced, or as the kids say, POG. And while it is not necessarily a great innovation, the way you need to use light to burn away the darkness around the hostile rude dudes like you would to a cave-dwelling seasonal isekai garbage eater is neat and can allow for some really interesting encounters. However, I will admit that the game can be a little too nice in the interest of making combat feel good. Think of the flashlight as a kind of laser pointer showing where you're aiming. But most people won't really give a shit about that because they won't really notice it as they will be too busy drowning in dopamine. But for those who do give a shit, the spin-off game, American Nightmare, rebalances the combat and tightens the aiming, and even has an arcade-style horde mode. As a side note, I will be making a separate but equally questionable video about American Nightmare for any masochists interested. So I've mentioned the difficulty a couple of times now, and I have to say the game is too easy on normal, meaning that pussies should play on normal and real gamers should play on Nightmare. Or not, bud, we all got shit to do. You should just do whatever's fun for you. What made normal boring for me was never feeling pressured to use any of the items I'd found and never having to run from the degenerate hordes, meaning that the game never really felt challenging. Luckily though, Nightmare difficulty did present a challenge in that it forced me to use my resources and occasionally have to run from encounters, desperately juking around flying axes and speedy little buttholes to try and make it to a safe spot of light. Basically, this difficulty is for people that want more intensity in their lives and to sit like this when in combat. However, while Nightmare is usually just right in terms of difficulty, there were a few occasions where the AI shit the bed, as it will sometimes cause the enemies to straight up kill themselves when hazards are nearby, or that it will break entirely during the turret sections of the game. but the times where the AI failed are few and far between, so honestly it's not that big of a deal, especially considering Alan Wake originally came out in 2010, and how the gameplay is more often than not very well executed. However, one aspect of this game I'm not really a fan of is how there aren't really bosses in Alan Wake. I mean, there are encounters which are clearly meant to be stand-ins for boss fights, but most of them boil down to just killing waves of mobs or using your flashlight to blow up evil tractors and shit. So essentially, the boss encounters are a string of set pieces culminating in a final showdown where you shoot an angry tornado with a flare gun. Fortunately though, most of these pseudo-boss fights range anywhere from okay to fucking hype, like when you go to the farm owned by the Viking rock stars and fight off enemies on a concert stage. Now, some of you might claim this part of the game is a bit out of place for a horror game, or that it's strange for a setup like this to just be chilling at a farm. But I fucking disagree, because firstly, this game is a horror game in the same way Rent-A-Girlfriend is a good anime. And secondly, the game, assuming you're fucking based and read the manuscript pages, sufficiently fleshes out the senile Viking rock stars to a level where you can accept that they are indeed eccentric enough to have a concert stage on their property, complete with a fully maintained light show and pyrotechnics. In fact, I'd say most of the characters are pretty fucking good. Alan, for instance, is extremely flawed, causing him to be a bit of a hothead and really fuck up sometimes, but is also passionate about the things and the people he cares about, and is willing to go that extra mile for them. All these things make him relatable, if not easy to root for. But enough about Alan, I want to talk about this Goliath of a man. I usually fucking hate the fat, goofy sidekick character, but Barry makes me a believer in that it can work, and he does this by doing a few very simple things that most of the major side characters in this game do. He doesn't act like a fucking idiot and isn't completely useless, all of which allows him to be likable.
Oh, I'm Alan Wake. I'm always right about everything, and if I don't get my way, I'll sulk all day long. I'm always intense and moody. It makes me very attractive and mysterious.
Look at him. Look at this fucking god. This absolute specimen of Chadley perfection. He realizes that the axe-wielding killers wreathed in darkness are hurt by the light. And guess what he does? He suits up and...
I can just look at one of those things and they die.
It's my flaming eye of Mordor.
a character acting in a more or less reasonable way. Wild. Crazy. Fuck you, Dab. I can't figure out how to segue into this. The cutscenes are peak Xbox 360.
The facial rigging reminds me of a nightmare where there's something wrong with people's faces, but you aren't entirely sure what.
But I'm mostly willing to give it a pass because of how old the game is. The actual gameplay looks alright though. The textures aren't amazing and sometimes things will render weirdly, but most of the time it looks fine. Except for the light effects, those look amazing all the time. And with all that out of the way, there's just one more thing I need to talk about. A worsening flaw that, like a melancholic elephant that keeps taking your food, has only gotten more upsetting and apparent with time. Alan Wake was released over a decade ago, which isn't a problem in of itself. I mean, being a bit older doesn't necessarily mean a thing, right? The issue is that the game and its DLC set itself up for a sequel, but ended with a cliffhanger, which fucking hurt, bro. Especially for the people that love the game. In fact, I think unsatisfying endings can potentially spoil the rest of something like this. Power of friendship looking yee-ass piece of shit. Call me a whiny bitch or whatever, but it's just how I feel. Endings are important, especially for narrative-driven projects. So it's a good fucking thing, Alan Wake 2's finally on its way, baby! Woo! Is Alan Wake good? Hell yeah!
It's not a lake. It's an